There we go. Sorry, guys, for the delay. Arthur, thank you. Thanks for accommodating us, Arthur.
Thanks, mate.
No, you guys in South Africa, I have to accommodate you, okay? You're South Africans, I mean.
Yeah.
Guys, I'm quite tired tonight, so please don't wake me up unless I start snoring, all right?
Okay.
I thought that was Kevin for a moment, sorry.
Okay, guys, here we go. There we go.
For Kevin now.
Okay, here we go. Okay, I just had to make the text bigger because I scanned some pages from that book, many pages. Okay, the next question is, can you hear me, guys?
We can.
Yeah.
Okay, pouring hot water in. Okay, any requests for refuah or for anything for somebody?
I think just for the soldiers still that are recovering from these last
terrorist attacks
of your incidents.
Amen. Refer Shlomo to all. Speedy refer Shlomo.
Amen, yeah.
Okay, so pouring hot water into a thermos on Shabbos, or which we call, I don't know what they call it, whatever, that thing that keeps water hot for you, boiling water. Question is it permitted to pour hot water from an urn into a thermos bottle on Shabbos? So that is the answer is, at first glance, it would appear that pouring hot water from an urn into a thermos would be forbidden because of the rabbinic injunction of hatmana, which prohibits insulating any hot food item on Shabbos, even if the insulation will merely maintain the present heat level and not intensify it. A thermos bottle is by definition an insulated vessel which maintains the heat of the liquid poured into it. So using it could be considered a violation of hatmana. Indeed, a minority view advises against using a thermos on Shabbos for this reason. But most contemporary poskim maintain that pouring hot water into a thermos is not a violation of hatmana and is permitted. The lenient view is based on the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch that hatmana is forbidden only in a kli rishon. That is the vessel in which the food was cooked.
Wow.
Once food or water is transferred into a kli sheni, second vessel, a prohibition of hatmana no longer applies. Since the thermos bottle is a kli sheni, there is no prohibition of hatmana. Let me just see that. Okay, let's leave it at that because there's a bit of further discussion I don't want to go into here. We can continue next time. Okay.
Aren't you tired, Kevin?
Yeah, I left at 1 o'clock this morning, and I hardly slept. Anyway, so if I doze off, I've got a good. You have to give it to me.
I'll send you to moichel.com.
Now, Arthur.
Yeah. You might not have, I said this joke to Kevin, but I didn't say it to you guys. Damon, you might appreciate it. So Kevin is supposed to take his turbo ride. But yeah, you can't blame him because he took a turbo flight. Isn't that good?
Yeah, exactly.
That's true.
Well, no, actually, I'm feeling awake, funny enough.
That's true.
Yeah, Kevin, it's because you're an hour behind.
Okay, let's get into some serious tomorrow.
Yeah, that's also true. Maybe. Right. Yeah.
Firstly, Kevin, I'd like to welcome you to South Africa, and I hope Hashem blesses you with safety while you're here. Really.
And to all, and Gam Lachem, to all of you.
And Kevin, bless you with electricity.
Oh man!
Listen, Arthur,
we're
not in an era. We learned that there was
no open miracles. Sorry,
miracles. Exactly.
My mistake. I'm trying to find the light here. I'm trying to make coffee.
All right, so guys, let's get started. So we're on the 71st daf, and the Gemara basically cites the clause of the Mishnah that reads, if one stole an ox or a sheep and then slaughtered it on Yom Kippur, he pays the 4 or 5-fold payment. Now, that was a shock for me, guys. Why do you think it was a shock for me? What do you think?
Yom Kippur, you think would be even stricter than Shabbos, so the death penalty should definitely apply.
Absolutely. It was a chiddush to me. I definitely thought it would be the death penalty. Anyway, the Gemara is obviously not surprised, only Damon Kabb because he's ignorant. But anyway, the Gemara asks, why is one who slaughters a stolen animal in Yom Kippur liable to the 4-fold or 5-fold payment? Granted, there's no court-imposed death penalty desecrating Yom Kippur, but there's at any rate a malchus penalty. Okay, so what do we mean? Is that basically, if you perform a forbidden labor on Yom Kippur, now we're not talking about Shabbos, we talk about Yom Kippur. You violated a prohibition, Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 23, verse 28. You remember that one, and you shall not do any work on this very day, and thus liable to malchus, which is lashes. So obviously, the Gemara derives that following verse, and it's accepted by us that one does not receive malchus and pay money for the same crime. So what rule is that, guys?
What's the one that you've said before?
That one. Yeah,
the rubber.
Kim labor di rubber mine. Exactly that. So what happened?
So close.
No, that was pretty close. So, in other words,
about 3 words right.
In Marcos in 4b, because I said to Gavin, if ever he learns the Gemara on his own, Marcos is the shortest of the Gemara books. It's actually quite nice to learn. And there was that rule, if you remember, we first learned it was in Devarim, Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 2, and it said, and the judge shall cast him down and lash him in accordance with his wickedness. It's not a parav pasuk. The word wickedness, which is in the singular form, indicates that you may punish him for one wickedness, but you may not punish him for two wickednesses, meaning that the court can't impose two kinds of penalty for the same act. So it's proving there that Rashi says that that's how we learn that even in that penalty, not just the death penalty, is that obviously lashes is more hectic than a monetary payment. And if you think not, I would pose a question to you. If you got stuck in the middle of Iran and they said, I'm going to beat you half to death, you can pay me a couple of dollars, what are you going to do, guys? You're going to fork out the wallet because nobody wants a beating. And by the way, people have died from beatings. It is an issue that, remember when we were at Lionel Horwitz, Kevin, they said that certain people with malchus, you had to be careful because they didn't know what the person could take necessarily. It was you had to be assessed and everything else. So if you're liable for malchus, you're exempt from the monetary penalty. And it's straight off in Ketubos 32b, so you can read it there as far as that's concerned. So the Gemara says, okay, so there's something wrong, because how can you pay the fourfold or fivefold payment? In other words, if you stole an ox or sheep and then slaughtered it on Yom Kippur, you're eligible for malchus. The human court isn't going to give you the death penalty, but if you're liable for malchus, you wouldn't have to have any payment because the lesser punishment, which is the payment, is waived in favor of malchus because we only give the greater penalty. So the lesser penalty is waived. So why would you pay the fourfold or fivefold payment? That's what the Gemara is asking. So the Gemara answers, who is the author of this Mishnah? It's authored by Rabbi Meir, who says that one can receive malchus and pay money for the same crime. Okay? So the Mishnah in Makot in 4a discusses the case of witnesses who testify that a person owes his fellow 200 zuz. And they're then found to be Eidim Zomimim, false witnesses, through the testimony of other witnesses who placed them elsewhere at the time of the alleged event. So the first group of witnesses against the defendant says, we saw him slaughter this animal in Johannesburg in Kippur. Second set of witnesses come and say that the first set of witnesses can't be there because they were vacationing with them in Cape Town. So then they proved to be conspiring witnesses. And in that case, those Zomimim should be liable to malchus for violating the prohibition. In other words, in that particular case, what do we do with Eidim Zomim off? I can't ask Kevin, he's off the hook because he had a flight. What do we do with Eidim Zomim?
What, when they're lying like that?
Well, what's the general rule with Adam Zummer?
Well, they'll end up paying, what's the name to you?
Paying what?
Paying the penalty to you, the double or whatever it is to you before lying.
They accused you of. That they accuse you.
Whatever they accuse you of, they get. Yeah. So
yes,
they accuse you of murder, they get killed.
Exactly. So, in other words, exactly what Kevin said and Arthur concurred with is that, and Gavin agreed, is that the case of Adam Zimmerman is they always get the penalty they try to enforce on others. So if they try to enforce the death penalty on a hapless victim, they get the death penalty, providing that obviously that victim hasn't been made to pay already for the crime. Because once the trial is over, the Adam Zimmerman don't get that punishment, because that punishment is actually a kapora for them to pay in this world for what they try to do to that person and make a mockery of the judicial system. If they were successful, then obviously it was decreed by Shemaim that this person would be what we would see innocently convicted, because in a previous incarnation they must have done something wrong when this incarnation to have, have a chain of events to unfold the way they did. It wasn't an accident, but the person responsible for choosing to be the shaliach, the messenger of that damage, will not get payment, a way to pay it off in this world. They'll be in deep trouble in the next world. Because if a person is attempting to murder somebody else, make a corruption of the justice system, and gets punished by being killed himself in this world, and he's genuinely sorry, then he's made it to Shuvah. But if he thinks he's getting off the hook, as Rabbi Yosef Mizrahi said, you don't get off the hook. It's better to pay in this world than in the next, because you're going to get caught. Rather get rid of the debt now. So exactly as you guys said, in this case where they said he slaughtered the animal in Yom Kippur, they know this person is going to get lashes. So therefore, if they were caught out by witnesses saying that these witnesses couldn't have watched him slaughter the animal in Yom Kippur because they were in a different province, then they will get malchus. That's a fact. So how do we know this? In Exodus Shmot chapter 20 verse 13, it says, "You shall not bear false witness," as well as to the reciprocal penalty. So always remember, guys, it's called a reciprocal penalty, decreed by the verse for Zomermin. And that's in Deuteronomy, Devarim, chapter 19, verse 19. We've gone through this many times. "And you shall do to him as he conspired to do to his brother." So the sages say in the Mishnah that they pay and do not receive malchus, because one does not receive malchus and pay for the same crime. But Rabbi Meir rules that they do receive malchus and pay the intended victim what they sought to take away from him, because their intention makes them liable for lashes is not the one that makes them liable for payment. In other words, the two penalties stem from two different verses, according to Rashi. So the one is in Exodus, Shmot chapter 20, verse 13, "You shall bear not false witness," as well as to the reciprocal penalty. And the other one had to do with a case in Deuteronomy. So in other words, because they derive from two different pasukim, Rabbi Meir would hold that the thief who slaughters a stolen animal in Yom Kippur receives lashes for desecrating Yom Kippur. That's number one. But he pays the fourfold or fivefold penalty for slaughtering the stolen animal, since the two penalties stem from two different verses. So guys, I want you to give it over to me, the reason why he would pay, according to Rabbi Meir, both malchus and the four or fivefold payment in this case, according to Rabbi Meir. Give me in your own words. Just want to see if you understood it. I mean, I can rush ahead, but I just want to see if you understood. Okay, so before we do that, what's the problem in this Gemara? How did it start? Just want to see if you guys can articulate it. Guys?
Yeah, I'm just thinking, hold on.
I dozed off for about 2-3 minutes. I don't know if you didn't see it. I told you I'm tired.
Okay, it's okay.
I didn't hear it, so I actually can't answer you at all. But hopefully the other guys, maybe somebody can.
Okay.
I can't.
Yeah, my mind is blank. I don't know if I'm just overtired or.
Okay, there are 4 steps. So let me just go through the 4 steps. Listen, guys, how I remember Gemara is also, I'm just knocking into simple baby steps because I'm not smart. So what the first thing of it is, the Gemara brings forward that if a person steals an ox or a sheep, it doesn't matter whichever one you stole, and then you slaughtered it on Yom Kippur, there's a 4 or 5-fold payment. So that was the first thing that shocked me, that there's no death penalty. So that's the first point of the Gemara. The second point is that we don't know why there's a 4 or 5-fold payment, because we know that if you desecrate Yom Kippur, what's the penalty, guys? So second point, what's the penalty for desecrating Yom Kippur?
Normally it should be death.
It should be death. I agree, because we think it would be like Shabbos, because the halachas are not like for Yom Kippur like a Yom Tov. It's actually much stricter. It's like Shabbos. So it was a chiddush. So then, what actually is the penalty for desecrating Yom Kippur? If you work on it, it's in Vayikra 23, chapter 28. Well, often what happens is when you see, I think it's a good point. Often when you see, for example, issues where there's malchus, there's karet that's tied with it. Often, by the way. But let's just look at an earthbound penalty here for a second. It's lashes. You do work on Yom Kippur, it's lashes. So the question of the Gemara is, okay, so first point...
Is that just working on Yom Kippur or breaking anything on Yom Kippur?
No.
You eat on Yom Kippur, is that
that's kares. That's the problem. That's kares.
Yeah, kares is separation, right?
Yeah, spiritual excision. There might also be lashes. I'll go into that. I haven't gone into that in too much depth. So
and also, like if you drive a car to shul, what is that?
So that's a problem. I think that would be that would go under the category of, at the very least, lashes. Obviously, there's a spiritual penalty. What I would have found out is there malchus and spiritual excision. But let's just look at earthbound penalties. So point number 1 of the Gemara, which was a shock to all of us, is that if you slaughter an animal in Yom Kippur, there's no death penalty. There's only a 4 or 5-fold payment. That's point number 1. Point number 2, there's an issue because you desecrate Yom Kippur, you get malchus. That's point number 2.
Yeah.
Point number 3, how can you pay the 4 or 5-fold payment when you're getting malchus as well? Because we learn in Makot that you would only pay the greater of the penalty. Because, how do we know this? In the verse in Deuteronomy, remember it says, and the judge shall cast him down and lash him in accordance with his wickedness. The word wickedness is in the singular form in Hebrew. Indicates you can only punish him for one wickedness. You can't punish him for 2 wickednesses. So in other words, the court can't impose 2 kinds of penalties for the same act. So what act makes him liable for malchus? Slaughtering an animal on Yom Kippur. What makes him liable for the 4 or 5-fold payment? Slaughtering a stolen animal on Yom Kippur. So the slaughter simultaneously creates malchus and the 4 or 5-fold payment if it's not your animal. So since we know that the rule of Kimlei B'di Rabba Minei applies to malchus as well, is that it's the stronger of the 2 penalties. Lashes is worse than financial penalties. Therefore, the financial penalty is waived. The stricter penalty is given, and a lesser punishment, Kimlei B'di Rabba Minei, is waived. So that's the third point. Okay? First point, it was a surprise to us. There's a 4 or 5-fold payment for slaughtering a stolen animal in Yom Kippur, not the death penalty. Second issue is it's a difficulty because there is no court-imposed death penalty for desecrating Yom Kippur. There is obviously a spiritual death penalty, it would seem. When it uses the term no court-imposed death penalty, it's obviously kares. but there is a punishment of malchus at the same time. So you can't receive malchus and pay money for the same crime. That's the second point, because it's caused by one act. When you slaughter a stolen animal, it's a 4 or 5-fold payment. When you slaughter that animal on Yom Kippur, it's malchus. We give malchus, there's no payment. Okay? The third step is Rabbi Meir, who says you can receive malchus and pay money for the same crime. That's the third point. Okay? And what's the fourth point? Why does he hold like that? And what's the reason, guys? Anything?
This is the most awake tonight.
Pardon? Guys, what's the reason?
The person is the most awake should answer.
Okay. Let me give you a simple reason. They're two different crimes. He's saying Rabbi Meir believes there's only Kimlei B'di Rabbi Minei if it's generally the same pasuk that invokes the crime. He holds by that. So, for example, if there's a pasuk that you steal an animal and slaughter it, and that's a 4 or 5-fold payment, and that pasuk is different to slaughtering an animal in Yom Kippur, you impose a penalty for each of the pasuk violations. Does that make sense? So what I'd be very interested in with Rabbi Meir is how does he hold that there's ever Kimlei B'di Rabbi Minei? Because generally, there's always two different pasuks. There's one for murder, or and maybe one for financial damage at the same time. What are we talking about? Say you burn a building with a person in it directly. And you remember there was an issue of Reish Lakish and Rav Yochanan, is that, where a person's fire is an extension of him, one's arrows or whatever, or burning one's property. So if you kill somebody and burn down their property, because that person's getting the death penalty, they waiver the sort of penalty that they have to pay, or their heirs waiver it because it doesn't take away from their family inheritance, having to pay for the building you burnt down. So Rabbi Meir might not hold by Kimlei B'di Rabbi Minei, because every case that I can think of, if one breaks Shabbos and creates financial damage or kills a person, creates financial, are two different pesukim. So therefore, I don't know if there is a case that Rabbi Meir holds by Kimlei B'di Rabbi Minei, unless it comes from the same pasuk, but it's pretty unlikely. So he says you can't have that because generally you have to pay a penalty for each pasuk you break. The rabbis don't hold like that. They hold by Kimlei B'di Rabbi Minei. All right. Okay. So at any rate, the Gemara said, the Gemara counters, if our Mishnah is indeed the opinion of Rabbi Meir. And why did we say it's like Rabbi Meir? Because you wouldn't pay the 4-fold or 5-fold if it's like the rabbis. Because if you're getting malchus, you don't have to pay the 4th or 5-fold payment. So therefore, it's suggested by the Gemara, it must hold like Rabbi Meir, that there's a 4 or 5-fold because you pay that in addition to the malchus. Because it's a different pasuk that's being broken in terms of crime. So the Gemara made that suggestion, and the Gemara counters, if our Mishnah is indeed the opinion of Rabbi Meir, then even if the thief slaughtered the stolen animal on Shabbat, he should also pay the 4-fold or 5-fold penalty. In other words, it's saying something quite hectic, is that even though, like if we take a case of Shabbos, where he's liable to the death penalty for performing a forbidden labor on the Sabbath, he should nevertheless pay the 4 or 5-fold penalty for slaughtering a stolen animal, because Rabbi Meir apparently doesn't exempt a sinner from monetary payment by virtue of him having simultaneously incurred a greater penalty, even if that greater penalty is a court-imposed death penalty. So that's exactly the point. If we take it to the most extreme, not malchus, we might say, if they're two different pesukim that created the problem, you might even say that if you slaughtered the animal Shabbos, you still pay the 4 or 5-fold. That's a suggestion by the Gemara. So the Gemara anticipates a possible answer. It says, perhaps you will say in reply to this question that Rabbi Meir holds that only one can receive malchus and pay for the same crime. Okay? But he does not hold that one can be put to death and pay for the same crime. In other words, it's saying maybe you can say in the case of liability to both execution and monetary payment, Rabbi Meir does apply the principle of he stands liable to the penalty greater than it. So maybe the suggestion from the Gemara is he only doesn't hold bakim leibadi Rabbi Meir when you've got a lesser penalty like malchus and a far lesser penalty than such as a financial penalty. You could have malchus and pay the 4 or 5-fold payment. But if it's as hectic as slaughtering the animal on Shabbos where there's a death penalty, Rabbi Meir might even waiver the 4 or 5-fold penalty, and in that case impose kim leibadi Rabbi Meir, that he stands liable to the penalty greater than that if execution is involved. That was the suggestion of the Gemara. That might be his exception. So I don't know what you guys think.
We don't at the moment.
Okay, that's fair enough. No, that's fair enough.
Being honest, my brain is like I'm talking and I'm hearing you, but I don't know if anything's going in. And I've heard this before. It's like
from Rabbi Cohen. Okay, so it was taught in we're going to end in a few minutes then. If one stole an ox or sheep and slaughtered it on Shabbat, or if you stole an ox or sheep or slaughtered it for idol worship, or if one stole an ox condemned to be stoned and slaughtered it, in all those cases he pays the 4 or 5-fold payment. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. So apparently then, obviously Rabbi Meir rules that he pays the 4-fold or 5-fold payment even when he slaughtered the animal on the Shabbos or for idol worship, in which case the thief simultaneously is liable for the death penalty as well. So in other words, we learned in this particular case that it doesn't matter if there's a death penalty. Rabbi Meir doesn't hold bakim leibadi Rabbi Meir specifically from this Mishnah, because if it was slaughtered on Shabbos or for idol worship, death penalty, guys, and there's a 4 or 5-fold payment because it's a different pasuk. So it seems that he would hold them liable for both, but the sages exempt a thief for the financial payment if he's going to lose his life. So evidently Rabbi Meir holds that one who simultaneously incurs liability for even the death penalty and payment is now subject to both penalties. It's not just in the case of malchus lashes. So the Gemara answers, you know what? I think, guys, before it gets more complicated, let's leave on that note. Let's stop the share on that note.
Good idea.
So you mean doing your point? Let's just go over.
I'm battling you.
Damon. See, I said David. I mean Damon.
Yeah.
Gavin, you more tired than me. That's not allowed. No excuses. I'm sorry. No, you haven't been. I know you have been.
No, I
under the
didn't
weather
sleep the
recently.
night before, and last night I had about maybe 2.5 hours sleep.
So. No, but still, you were still very good. But Damon, sorry, Kim Lei, but how do you say it again?
Kim Lei, but the Rabbi Meir.
And what's a simple definition of that?
Okay, so the simplest definition that I could think of is he stands liable to the penalty greater than it.
Okay.
Which means,
so if there are two penalties, the greater penalty would apply.
Yeah, if there are two penalties incurred simultaneously with the same act at the same time juncture, in that particular case, he would only have to suffer the greater penalty. Correct.
As to say, at the same time juncture.
Yeah. In other words,
just say that again.
The penalty has to occur simultaneously at the same time juncture, which means we learned this before. When a person steals an animal carcass and throws it over his neighbor's wall, and he breaks Shabbos by taking it in the public domain to a private domain, he incurs a death penalty for breaking Shabbos. but the acquisition doesn't happen until it hits. The acquisition happens in airspace, but the breaking of Shabbos doesn't happen until it hits the ground. But according to Rabbi Akiva, breaking of Shabbos can happen in the airspace, and that's done at the same time as there's a kinyan, as a transaction takes place. And therefore, according to Rabbi Akiva, you'd have kimle b'di rabbi minay, meaning at the same time as Shabbos was broken, the financial transaction occurred at which there's a liability for a 4 or 5-fold payment. And since the thief is getting the death penalty for breaking Shabbos, or even if he doesn't get it, but he would be eligible for it under the right circumstances, the 4 or 5-fold penalties waive it. So we say, well, then that only accords with Rabbi Akiva. And we said with the sages, as long as the buyer made a stipulation that the transaction, the kinyan only takes effect when the animal's not in the airspace but lands on his property on the ground. And that's the same time at which Shabbos is broken from a public domain to a private, is when it actually lands. According to the rabbis, that would constitute a validity of kimle b'di rabbi minay, that when that thief got the death penalty for breaking Shabbos, he's waived of the 4 or 5-fold penalty for selling the stolen animal. So it has to occur in the same time juncture. And for the same act. Exactly the same act. Yeah.
But how you see, if the carcass is thrown over from a private into the airspace of the public, public domain.
It starts in the public, and I throw it into the buyer's.
Into private, okay. So, but how do you determine if that airspace is actually private domain?
Well,
how's it measured?
Great question. If there's a fence up, and I manage to get it across.
Okay, it has to be physical. It has to be seen.
Yeah.
It has to be actual.
Well, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it might not be seen. In other words, he might not technically get the death penalty because there might have been only one witness where he wasn't warned before the oak worked out what was going on. But because under the right circumstances, he would be eligible for the death penalty for breaking Shabbos, even if it wasn't implied because there were some features missing, he's still off the hook for the 4 or 5-fold payment because that's still kimle b'di rabbi minay, for even having a circumstance that could warrant the death penalty, even if it wouldn't in actualization materialize. If that's done at the same time as the theft crime, and the two crimes were the same at the same time juncture, kimle b'di rabbi minay applies. For example, you burn a person's building down and they're in it. Well, you created property damage and killed a person, so you don't have to pay for the property damage. Nor do the heirs, by the way, the person that's inheriting the estate in that case. Because that person's dead. How's he going to pay the debt? He's not expected to pay the debt before, and I don't think his heirs are. So that's a case where there's arson that results in property damage and murder. Same act, kimle b'di rabbi minay, breaking of Shabbos, and also incurring a penalty for theft and slaughtering, or theft and selling whilst breaking Shabbos, or something like that. That's also a case. Or burning a person's Picasso on Shabbos, you cost him 20 million, but the person could get the death penalty. But the person that arsonist is smart enough not to have two witnesses around. There's only one witness. In fact, if he doesn't want to pay for the Picasso, he calls one person over and then lights it, then he can't get the death penalty. He wasn't warned. The guy didn't know what he was going to do. There's one witness, but he's off the hook financially, but he doesn't get the death penalty. But because he could have under the right circumstance, kimle b'di rabbi minay is off the hook. Yeah.
So Damon, you're going to write a book on how to get off the hook, eh?
Yeah,